Good evening. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, let your day loosen its grip just a little. Settle your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and allow your breathing to become unhurried. Nothing needs to be solved right now, and nothing needs to be decided. You're allowed to rest. In a moment, you'll step into a quiet inner courtyard in springtime, where the air is cool and clean, where water speaks in a calm, steady voice, and where soft lantern light makes every leaf look gentle. As you listen, you can simply follow the sensations: the hush of fog, the scent of wet greenery, the echo of footsteps, the warmth of stone under a resting hand. Take this time for yourself. Let the story carry you slowly toward sleep. The evening had arrived without drama, the way a kind evening does, softly, almost politely. The sky had turned a muted blue-gray, as if someone had washed the color and hung it to dry. A faint spring fog drifted through the streets in thin layers, not thick enough to hide anything, only enough to blur edges and make distances feel shorter. Street sounds were gentler too, muffled at the corners, as though the whole neighborhood had agreed to speak quietly. A person on a short walk moved along the sidewalk at an unhurried pace. No rush, no destination that demanded attention, just the simple intention of stretching the day into something calmer. Their hands stayed relaxed by their sides, fingers slightly curled in the cool air. The pace of their steps matched their breathing, and their breathing matched the evening. Slow, even, patient. Spring had brought its particular kind of freshness, the kind that isn't bright or sharp, but damp and alive. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and leaves that had recently been rinsed by rain. Somewhere, a tree had begun to bud, and even that subtle green seemed to have a scent, like a promise you could inhale. They turned down a narrower passageway between buildings, where the sounds of traffic faded into a distant hum. The fog gathered a little more here, pooling in the sheltered corridor. Light from windows and a few wall lamps fell onto the pavement in soft patches, like warm cloth laid gently across stone. The person's footsteps made a small echo in the passage, quiet taps that returned to them a half-second later, softened by damp air. At the end of the passage was an old iron gate, slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way on purpose. Beyond it lay an inner courtyard, one of those hidden spaces that feels like a secret even if it belongs to many people. The person paused at the threshold, not out of caution, but out of appreciation. It was the kind of pause that says, "This is where I can exhale." They stepped inside, and the gate gave a mild, friendly creak as it shifted, then settled again. The courtyard was modest in size, enclosed by walls that rose just high enough to make the space feel protected. The walls were covered in ivy, thick and patient, climbing in overlapping layers. The leaves caught the lantern light and held it as a soft shine, each leaf reflecting a small, blurred version of the evening. In the center of the courtyard stood a fountain. It wasn't grand, but it had presence. A low circular basin of pale stone, smooth from years of weather and touch. In the middle, a simple column rose, and from its top water slipped and spilled in a continuous ribbon. It didn't roar or splash loudly. It murmured. It spoke in the steady language of water that has nowhere else to be. As the person walked closer, the sound grew clearer, a layering of tones. The initial spill, the soft strike against the basin's surface, the gentle swirl as water turned itself into small eddies, then the quietest part, the return, the way it gathered and flowed back into itself. It was like listening to a calm conversation where every sentence ends in reassurance. Fog hovered low across the courtyard stones, catching the lamplight and turning it into a faint glow. The lanterns were mounted along the walls, their glass slightly fogged from the cool air. They didn't cast harsh shadows. Instead, they created a gentle gradient, bright near the lamps and dim toward the corners. The ivy looked darker in those corners, not threatening, just restful, like a blanket folded neatly. The person's shoes made a soft sound on the damp ground, and the courtyard answered with a quiet echo, one that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Not a sharp echo, more like a remembered sound. The fountain's voice filled the rest of the space, so the echo never felt empty. Everything here seemed balanced. Water and stone, light and fog, stillness and motion. They approached the fountain's basin and slowed further until walking turned into arriving. A stone bench curved along part of the fountain's edge, its surface worn smooth. The person sat down carefully, letting the coolness of the air meet the warmth that remained in the stone from the day's earlier sun. That warmth was subtle but unmistakable. It rose into their palm when they placed a hand on the bench beside them, as if the stone had kept a small memory of daylight. They adjusted their posture until it felt effortless. Feet planted, shoulders loose, hands resting one on their knee, the other on the warm stone. Their gaze lifted to the falling water and held there, no need to analyze it, no need to name it. Just watching, just listening. The fountain's stream caught the lantern light and broke it into tiny moving highlights. Each highlight appeared and disappeared, like a calm thought passing through the mind without sticking. The water slid over stone in a smooth sheet, then separated into strands, then reunited again in the basin. The person noticed that the water never seemed to hesitate. It simply followed gravity with trust. They let their breathing follow the fountain's rhythm. Inhale soft, exhale longer. The body responds quickly to such cues when given permission. The jaw loosened, the forehead smoothed, the muscles around the eyes relaxed, as if they were glad to stop focusing on screens and tasks and distances. A faint breeze slipped through the courtyard, stirring the ivy. Leaves shifted and rubbed lightly against one another, creating a sound like quiet fabric. Water, leaves, and distant city hush blended into a single calm texture. The person tilted their head slightly, letting their ears take in the space, the fountain close and constant, the ivy whispering now and then, and beyond the walls, a softened world. The smell in the courtyard was particularly soothing. Wet greenery, moss, damp stone. It was the scent of a place that had been watered and cooled. A place where plants could breathe without effort. The person inhaled slowly and felt that scent move through them. It didn't demand attention. It just made the inside of the chest feel a little more spacious. They leaned forward a little and looked at the ivy more closely. The leaves varied, some small and new, lighter in color, with tender veins, others larger and darker, more confident. Tiny beads of moisture clung to leaf edges and occasionally let go, falling to the stones below in almost silent drops. Each drop made a small sound if it landed on a leaf, an even smaller sound if it landed on stone. and sometimes no sound at all, just a ripple in the fog stillness. The person extended a hand toward the ivy where it grew thickest along the wall, close enough to touch. Their fingers hovered for a moment, then gently brushed a leaf. The leaf was cool and slick with moisture, but not unpleasant, more like a fresh cloth. They traced the edge lightly, careful not to tear anything. The leaf bent and returned, resilient, as if it had practiced patience for years. Their hand returned to the fountain's stone rim. The rim was smoother than it looked, rounded from time and weather and countless hands. It was warm in places, cooler in others, as though the stone carried a map of the day. Sun here, shade there, waters chill near the basin. The person let their fingertips travel along that rim, slow and thoughtful, feeling every minor change in texture, tiny pits where air bubbles once sat in the stone, faint ridges that marked old repairs. There was comfort in how tangible it all was. Water had weight and sound. Stone had temperature and grain. Leaves had shape and scent. Fog had presence even when it barely showed itself. The person didn't have to imagine calm. They could touch it. The courtyard's acoustics made everything feel close. When the fountain's stream struck the basin, the sound bounced gently off the ivy-covered walls and came back softened. The echo was not separate, it blended, as if the courtyard was humming along. The person listened closely and noticed layers in the sound, higher notes where water splashed on water, lower notes where it struck stone, a faint hollow resonance from within the basin itself. It reminded them of how a seashell holds the ocean's sound, even when there is no ocean nearby. Here, the courtyard held the sound of water, as if water were the whole point of the world. The mind, which so often runs ahead, began to settle into the present, content to circle gently around these sensations. A lantern flickered once, barely noticeable, and the light on the fog trembled. The person watched the tremble and then watched it still again. It was a simple thing, but it felt meaningful in a quiet way. Even light knows how to rest. The ivy's shadows shifted slightly, then returned to their soft, familiar shapes. Somewhere above, a window was open a crack. The person couldn't see who lived there, and they didn't need to. A faint trace of warmth drifted down, maybe from tea, maybe maybe from a room recently lived in. It mixed with the scent of wet leaves and stone, creating a gentle contrast. Cool outside, warm somewhere nearby. The whole courtyard felt like a safe pocket of evening. The person's thoughts began to slow, not by force, but by distraction, by the kind of distraction that is actually a return. They thought briefly of their day, but the day appeared like a distant shoreline, not urgent. A conversation, a task, a message, these were small shapes far away. Here, the fountain's voice was closer and kinder, and it invited the mind to loosen its grip. They looked down into the basin. The water was dark, not murky, dark like a polished surface reflecting the night. The lantern light made long pale streaks across it, wavering with every ripple. Occasionally, a small bubble rose and broke, making a tiny ring that expanded and disappeared. The person watched those rings spread outward, meeting others, dissolving, becoming the surface again. There was something deeply reassuring about that pattern. A disturbance happens, and then it passes. A ring expands, and then it's gone. Nothing stays sharp for long in water. The person's breathing deepened again, as if their body understood the lesson without needing words. They rested both hands on the stone now, palms down, fingers spread slightly. The stone's warmth met them more fully. It wasn't hot, just gently radiant, like a memory of sunlight stored beneath the surface. The person imagined the stone spending the whole day outside, receiving light without hurry, then offering that light back in the evening, slowly, generously. Fog drifted in a thin veil between the person and the far wall. It made the ivy look like it was painted in watercolor. The lantern's glow diffused through it, and every corner of the courtyard looked softer, less defined. The person's eyes relaxed further. It was easy not to focus sharply here. Soft focus felt appropriate, like letting the world be kind instead of insisting it be precise. A faint drop of water splashed higher than the rest and landed on the stone rim near the person's hand. The drop was cool against the warm stone, and it left a small dark spot that gradually spread and faded. The person watched the spot change shape, then vanish into the stone's overall dampness. The courtyard was full of such small transitions, quiet changes that asked for no reaction. only noticing. They shifted slightly on the bench, finding the most comfortable position. The movement was slow enough that it barely disturbed the calm. When they settled again, the echo of the shift, cloth against stone, shoe against damp ground, was so faint it felt like the courtyard simply acknowledged them, and then returned to its own breathing. The fountain never stopped, patient and constant. The person lifted their gaze to the ivy again and followed one long vine upward. It climbed with determination, but without urgency, attaching itself in small points, finding support where it could. The vine's path was not straight. It curved, paused, branched, continued. It seemed to say that progress could be quiet, that reaching upward did not require strain. At the top edge of the wall, the ivy met the night sky. Beyond that edge, the fog thinned, and the sky opened into a darker space, with no sharp stars visible, only a dim glow from the city and the thick spring air. Even the sky looked restful, like a ceiling drawn close to keep the world warm. The person listened again for the echoes. When they gently tapped the stone rim with a fingernail, just once, the sound was small and clear. It traveled outward, met the ivy, and returned as something even softer, as if the courtyard had padded it with leaves. The person smiled very slightly, then let their hand become still again. They began to notice how the fountain's sound changed depending on attention. When they listened broadly, it was one soothing wash. When they listened closely, it separated into distinct textures. A thin ribbon of falling water, the delicate patter where droplets separated, the deeper tone where water met the basin. The person's mind, which often wants to categorize, found it could rest in simply distinguishing without judging. A small moth appeared in the lantern light, fluttering calmly, not frantic. It circled once, twice, then drifted away into the fog. The person watched it go and felt a quiet kinship, another living thing moving gently through the evening, guided by light and instinct, not by schedules. Time in the courtyard behaved differently. Minutes didn't stack up like tasks. They spread out like ripples present, widening, dissolving. The person's short walk had already done what it needed to do. It had brought them here. Now, sitting at the fountain, they felt felt the remaining tension in their body continue to drain away, drop by drop, like water finding its level. They closed their eyes for a moment and listened. With eyes closed, the courtyard expanded. The fountain's sound became a landscape. The ivy's occasional whisper became a distant tree line. The echo of a far-off footstep outside the courtyard became a reminder that the world continued, but at a respectful distance. The person's own breathing became part of the environment, another gentle rhythm among gentle rhythms. When they opened their eyes again, the lantern light seemed slightly warmer, not because it had changed, but because the person had. Calm makes the world feel softer. The stone under their hand felt more distinctly warm now, and the water's coolness felt more refreshing than cold. The fog looked less like a veil and more like a blanket for the courtyard, something protective and kind. They leaned forward to look at the water's edge where it met stone. There, the surface created a narrow line, and tiny ripples licked the rim in repeated, delicate motions. Each motion left a faint shimmer on the stone, a wet gloss that caught light briefly and then dulled again. The repetition was soothing, like a lullaby without words. The person's fingertips followed that wet line for a short distance, slow enough not to splash, careful enough to respect the water. Their skin felt the boundary between warm stone and cool water. That contrast anchored them in their senses. It reminded them that their body was here, in this courtyard, safe and steady, and that the mind could settle because the present moment was not asking for anything. The scent of wet greenery rose again, stronger for a moment as the breeze shifted. It brought with it a hint of something earthy, moss, perhaps, or the damp soil behind the ivy's roots. The person inhaled and felt their shoulders drop a fraction lower. It was the kind of smell that suggests growth without pressure, life continuing quietly. They looked at the lanterns mounted along the walls. Each lantern had a small crown of metal at the top and glass panes that slightly distorted the flame or bulb within, turning it into a soft oval glow. The light painted the courtyard in gentle gradients and made the fog luminous. The person noticed how the light caught on water droplets clinging to ivy leaves, making tiny beads look like dim stars. If there were no stars in the sky tonight, there were plenty distant sound reached the courtyard, perhaps a car door closing somewhere beyond the wall, or a bicycle passing on wet pavement. It came and went without disturbing the space, like a brief reminder that the courtyard was a calm center in a moving city. The person didn't feel pulled outward by it. The fountain kept speaking. The ivy kept holding the walls. The fog kept floating. They rested their head back slightly and let their gaze soften again. At the edge of the courtyard, near the gate, the fog looked thicker, and the passageway beyond seemed like a gentle corridor back to the world. The person knew they would return through it soon, but there was no need to hurry. The evening still had room. The fountain's water continued its steady cycle, falling, gathering, returning, falling, gathering, returning. The person felt an internal mirroring. Thoughts might fall into the mind, gather briefly, then return to stillness. Feelings might arise, be noticed, then pass. The courtyard did not demand permanent calm. It simply offered a place where calm was easy to practice. They placed both palms on the stone again and warmed them there. The stone's warmth seemed to travel upward through their hands and into their arms, a slow, comforting creep. The person imagined the warmth moving through the body like lantern light, moving through fog diffused, gentle, without sharp edges. It made the chest feel less tight, the belly less clenched, the legs heavier in a pleasant way. They looked down at their own hands for a moment. In the lantern light, the skin looked softer, shadows between fingers deeper. A thin sheen of moisture from the damp air made the knuckles faintly reflective. The person flexed their fingers once, slowly, then relaxed them again, as if reminding the body, you can be at ease. The sound of the fountain seemed to fill every gap. Where silence might have allowed anxious thoughts to slip in, the water offered steady companionship. It was not loud enough to demand attention, only present enough to make the mind feel held. The person listened for the lowest tone, the one that came from water meeting stone, and found it deep and comforting, like a distant drum that keeps time for sleep. The fog thickened slightly, the way fog sometimes does as night deepens. The lantern light became even more diffuse, turning the courtyard into a small dream. Ivy leaves closer to the lamps glowed. Leaves farther away became shapes, then hints of shapes. The person's eyes naturally began to blink more slowly, the lids lingering a fraction longer each time. They realized with gentle satisfaction that this short walk had become exactly what they needed. Not entertainment, not distraction, but a quiet reset. Sitting here, they felt like a glass that had been set down after being carried too long. Finally, the shaking stops. Finally, the surface becomes smooth again. They leaned slightly toward the fountain and listened as if they could hear the water's origin. Of course, it was a pump, a closed cycle. But listening to it, it felt older than that. It felt like a spring that had always been here, a simple source, offering its sound the way a tree offers shade. The person didn't need the mechanism. They only needed the experience. Water moving in the cool evening in a courtyard wrapped in ivy and fog. A single droplet slid off the edge of an ivy leaf and landed in the basin. The sound was delicate, almost nothing, yet distinct enough to be heard if you were listening the way the person was listening now, attentive, quiet, willing to notice small things. The droplet made a tiny ring on the dark surface, and the ring moved outward, met the fountain's constant ripples, and disappeared into them as if welcomed. The person breathed in and out again, slowly. The air felt cool in the nostrils and slightly warmer as it left the mouth. They noticed the sensation without naming it as good or bad. Just cool, then warm. In, then out. The simplest pattern, the most reliable. At last, they felt the body signal in subtle ways that it was ready to go, ready to return home, ready to carry this calm back through the gate. Not because the courtyard's comfort had run out, but because it had been received. The person sat up a little straighter, then placed one hand on the stone rim one final time, letting their palm rest there as if to memorize the temperature. They stood slowly. The fountain's sound didn't change, but their relationship to it did. Standing made it feel slightly farther away, as if it now belonged to the courtyard again, rather than to their private moment. They took a step, and the courtyard answered with that soft echo shoe on damp stone, sound returning gently off ivy. The echo felt like a polite farewell. They walked toward the gate at the same calm pace they'd used to enter. Fog curled around their ankles and lantern light followed them in quiet patches. Near the gate, they turned back for a moment. The fountain sat in the center, steady and luminous. The ivy climbed the walls like a patient embrace. The courtyard looked like a small world that could continue being peaceful even when no one watched it. The person nodded slightly, as if thanking the space without words. Then they slipped through the gate and into the passageway beyond. The gate creaked again, soft and familiar, and settled into place. The fountain's sound faded quickly once the walls no longer carried it. Yet inside the person, something of it remained, an inner murmur, a remembered rhythm. As they walked back along the street, the city sounds were still softened by fog. Lights were still gentle. The spring air still smelled faintly of wet leaves and stone. Each breath carried that clean dampness, and each step felt unhurried. The person's shoulders remained loose, their gaze soft. The short walk had done its quiet work. When they reached their door, they paused again, just long enough to notice how calm can travel. It had begun in a hidden courtyard, beside a modest fountain, among ivy and lantern light. Now it was here too, carried in the body like warmth in the palms. Inside, the world could be quiet again. The person imagined the fountain continuing its steady cycle in the courtyard, water falling and returning, echo softened by ivy, fog glowing softly under lanterns. They imagined it as a place that would still be there tomorrow, and the next day, and whenever they needed a gentle evening to lean on. And with that thought, water repeating its calm, stone holding its warmth, leaves shining with damp light, their mind had something simple to follow, a steady sound, a cool spring fog, a quiet courtyard that breathes in echoes and exhales peace.